thanks a lot for the invitation and the nice introduction, Ferdinand. So we don't know each other personally, but I've been following ECOLOPES development since the beginning. While of course I was researching during the demo project, as you introduced already. And of course I came across the ECOLOPES consortium and aims and ambitious projects. So I'm really also looking forward to see your first result and publication, which are already coming up online. So is it okay? I can share my screen and start with the presentation mode. Do you see my screen in presentation mode?
Yes, looks well.
Okay, thanks a lot. So as Ferdinand was saying, I will talk about not only the demo project, but also research and teaching I've been doing since the last 10 years, more or less. So since I started my PhD in 2013 at the University of Palermo, after graduating in architecture, and I've done also a master of a second level at university level of ecological restoration. So I kind of try to merge the two words of ecology and design, and at the end the demo project is the result of this synergy, theoretically and practically. The title of the talk is Designed Habitats, also because I will talk about green roofs as case study of all the approach about biodiversity, green infrastructure, and etc. And also the monitoring, the relationship between monitoring, retrofitting, and design. Let's call it living architecture. There are broad and several other ways to define it, but I decided to choose this living architecture, which is kind of resuming several approaches. So shortly, I was already introduced quite extensively and in detail. So here's some QR code of some socials for further contacts if we want to keep in contact later for further project development or other inquiries. So I won't spend too much words already on myself. And I will start with a talk and the first part of it, which is the feedback loop between monitoring and ecological landscape design. And I picked, of course, the study case of green roofs, and in particular, the rise of biodiverse green roofs, Europe-wide at least. So everything started with the PhD work of Stefan Brenneisen, who is one of the professors here at ZHW. And this in 2003, 2006, so between the end of his PhD and the publication of the thesis. And it's a research which is focusing on the compensation value of green roofs, and in particular the parallel or the relationship within the green roofs and the surrounding habitats, especially the one which are worth of natural conservation. And the research was focused on arthropods diversity. Arthropods are bioindicators. And of course, the research is still ongoing because the monitoring and design is, as I mentioned, a feedback loop. It's something which shouldn't stop or be broken because there's always new insight which should be brought back into design project approach and process. In a similar, or better to say, in the same moment, the research was focused not only on arthropods, but also on the ground nesting bird. Here we see some figures of the endangered species lapwing. This research was carried out by Natalie Baum, which is as well working here as a lecturer at the ZHW. This research as well was published in this urban habitats volume, which is kind of collecting very interesting input that then I brought into my research also nowadays. So this kind of years, 2006, is quite emblematic and important for this kind of theoretical but also practical input. Then the relationship between the monitoring and the ecological landscape design was clear when the green roof was designed according to the output of this monitoring research. So at the end, to sum it up and to resume it, why create flat green roofs? It is way more interesting to create a landscape on a roof by varying substrate thickness, by varying the kind of substrate, which is in turn hosting different biosynoses. So it is not only a matter of biomass. The more water, the higher thickness, the more the water, the more the biomass, but it's also a matter of biodiversity. Biodiversity, which is supported also by extra features and structure. And I had the opportunity to write a paper, unfortunately in Italian. So only some of you can read it, but there is in fact already a translated version which I posted on ResearchGate just to follow. And this paper is summing up the key features, which were already published by Stefan, by Natalie, and I wanted to kind of put them together on Reticula, which is an online journal by the Italian Institute for Environmental Research and Protection. And here is clear, I mean, the figures talk by themselves, and it's nice to see how as soon as the substrate change as well, of course, the vegetation with more or less dominance of mosses and lichens and sedum species, but also grasses all over the season vary. And it is nice to see how resilience landscape can be also created on roofs. Again, here, the relationship between the monitoring and the design. And we published last year with Natalie a chapter in a book I co-edited, which is named Improving Extensive Green Roof for Endangered Ground Nesting Birds. So it's kind of taking the idea of animal-aided design, which is of course part as well of the ECOLOPES approach, and this kind of giving solutions for existing artificial habitats like the one on green roofs. And at last but not the least, green roofs are still a technological system which have to fulfill and follow norms and guidelines. For West German, the FLL are quite known. In Switzerland, there are the SIA norms, so for the Architects and Engineer Association. And so we had the chance and possibility as well to investigate not only biodiversity aspect, but also technological aspect by applying local substrate and mixed with straw or wool. And of course, by using local seed collected by hands, collected by hay, on the hay, and by drying it out on a, let's say on the ground from where to collect them afterwards. And as well, so let's say the connection between innovation and sustainability applied on green roofs in terms of developing substrate in an upcycling perspective. So using local substrate, which are generally considered as leftover, like Feldstein in German, which is part of the production of the sugarcane. Mixed with biochar, wool, and or straw. So always the focus is, of course, the relationship between substrate and plant. Research, which is also applied not only in or tested on test sites, but also on one-to-one constructions, like on a real roof, which is something quite innovative in the Swiss environment, but that is of course requires a lot of logistic and coordination organization. Another important aspect is of course the seed production, and this is now let's say connected back to biodiversity, yet connected to innovation and the norms. For example, the Swiss norm are introduced like 4 classes. This as well is not only the connection between innovation and biodiversity, but also research. In fact, the SIA norms came out after the research that has been done, as I mentioned, by Stefan Brenais and Natalie Baumann. And so there is a very strong relationship in the world of green roofs between research and then guidelines or Richtlinien, so guidelines or norms. And in the particular case, which I synthesized in these slides, we have tried different way to green the roofs by applying the hay, meaning selecting first a donor meadow with a suitable condition or better similar to the green roofs, which should host and hold the hay, and or the threshed hay, which means the seed only, as you see in the picture up there. And this let's say bring to the further topic, which is the plant species selection. So how to select a plant species, and now the focus is on vegetation science. There are several studies which monitored in terms of vegetation green roofs and several green roofs types. Of course, green roof is not only one type of green roofs. There are several kinds of green roofs, and within extensive green roof, there are already flat roofs, pitched roofs. So the orientation, the thickness is really always varying the vegetation which can develop and establish itself on them. Here we have an example by Christine Turing, which published as well a very nice chapter in our book. So urban services to ecosystems. And there it is clear how the different roofs could be grouped according to the vegetation types in sedum meadows, in species poor sedum roofs, or pitched sedum meadows. Or the research I carried out in Hanover, in the northern part of Germany, so in Niedersachsen, Lower Saxony. And it is very important to establish long-term vegetation studies, always to let's say, deliver more input and information for ecological landscape design. In this case, we focused on different plant traits, so life forms, dispersal strategies, life strategies, MROP degrees, and chorologic units to characterize the ecology of the roof, and also to derive, of course, important information for species selection, as I will show afterwards. And what was interesting to see, because we were lucky enough to have a different vegetation releve or campaign during time. So we had the luck to compare a data set of 1987, 1999, and 2014. And we have seen, of course, a shift towards thermoxeris condition when we compare the initial species seed that were sown on the roof. I have to mention that the roof were not maintained all over their lifespan, at least during the surveys. And there is an important aspect which till now was more or less neglected, which is the presence of several therophytes, also because the roofs, the green roofs, especially the extensive green roofs, will vary during time, during seasons, and the therophytes, of course, as in the Mediterranean areas, a very important species group, which nowadays, or till now, is a bit neglected, as I mentioned already. And an increase, we also notice an increase in rural and stress tolerant, especially because we consider the pitched roof. So of course we have also different habitat patches, as it is clear on the figures. And also an increase in short distance and dispersal species. But something quite interesting is that the zoochory, so the preference of animals, was quite an important factor to shape the vegetation composition of the investigated roofs. So it is not trivial to make, or at least less important to make green roofs attractive for species, because this also can guarantee more resilience of the system, and also can guarantee an input of new species during time. This will, of course, bring to the next topic, which is habitat template approach, which is, of course, based on vegetation science. And the idea is to, as the name of the approach says itself, to consider a habitat as a template to select plant species. This was introduced by Jeremy Lundholm in 2006. So as I mentioned again, this 2006 and this publication, Urban Habitats, has inside quite a lot of important inputs for the research and the red line, let's say, of the discussion I'm having today. And the important hypothesis behind it is, of course, the strong fit between species and their preferred habitats. This is why we should consider habitat as a template to select the species who lives in nature in similar condition than on the target habitat we want to replicate, in this case, green roofs. A similar approach was then taken again as an example in 2014 for Mediterranean habitat, which is till now an area where there are not so many green roofs, so they're not part yet of the traditional or conventional way to construct building or to green building, but there is a lot of potential. Also because Mediterranean areas are a hotspot of biodiversity. So it should be, or it can be more, it should be, let's say, a more mainstreamed example. And hopefully in the future, after the resilience and the programs that the Italian ministry is introducing, it will be a new way of seeing our buildings, also in the Mediterranean. In this approach, so we have as a reference habitat garrigue, which again in therophytes, which could be combined with mosses and lichens, calcareous grasslands with few therophytes and geophyte, Mesophilus and Xerophilus garrigue, again in patches of habitats, so with dry grasslands and very few therophytes. So, and here again, the importance of animal species and the changing of the aspect, of course, related to this habitat. This approach lead again to the phytosociological approach, which we developed more or less 10 years ago, and was not yet applied in the Mediterranean, but it has a lot of potentials as well, and it considers Mediterranean habitat a source of not only plants and seed mixtures, let's say, but also plant assemblages. So by taking inspiration by plant communities, we could not only derive species list, but also how to combine them together, because species in nature live together in a kind of systematic way according to the environmental conditions. So why don't do the same thing that is happening in nature? A further step is in the habitat template approach, and the phytosociological approach is a species filtering approach, I named it, which is the development of screening tool. This was possible, and this is possible because there are extensive data sets and databases which contains these informations Europe-wide and worldwide, I would say. So it is an approach which can be applied in a systematic way in any condition, of course, by varying the filters. In this example I brought here is a study carried out by Canepa group in Rome. And they applied by the on the data set of the Italian flora, synecological, structural, and ecological filters, as it is shown in this very nice diagram taken by the paper. But at the end, the aim is to get suitable species. So how to select plant species for a target habitat, in this case, a study, in this case study, green roofs. So by doing cross-selection, it's possible to gather species, but how to combine them is not here mentioned. And also here, animal species were, as you see in the figure, were excluded. So in fact, it is always a mix of exclusion criteria and inclusion criteria, which are taken by the traits within the traits, which is of course known for each species of any flora. Here we have another example following the same approach, species filtering approach. And there is always a starting species list. It can be the flora of all country, like in the case of Caneva. It can be another subset, let's say, of species, which in this case I brought here by Van Mechelen Group, is species list derived by existing studies on green roofs, of course, in Northern and Western Europe, which is taken as a reference data set, and Mediterranean plant species list of species which could be hosted on green roofs, which also are taken on natural habitats, sharing the same conditions as I mentioned already in the habitat template approach. And this brings to the next topic, which is not anymore focused on new green roofs, so new design, but on existing green roofs. What do we do with the building we already have with biodiversity poor condition, let's say? There are options to use this systematic approach, the species filtering, and we wrote this nice chapter published in the book Eco-Editor that I mentioned before, Urban Services to Ecosystems, named by like a plant sociological procedure to distinguish it from the approach I mentioned before. So considering the habitat template approach, the species filtering approach, and the sociological approach, we came up with this new proposed procedure, which is focused on retrofitting. And so the study case in Zurich, the Technopark, we had, let's say, a first list of species which were recorded on the roof, sown and spontaneous. And we used then the database for the Swiss flora indicativa. And so we could characterize the roof in ecological terms by using Landel's ecological indicators, soil aeration and humus content, but also, of course, life forms to determine the plant structural pattern, the soil structure, and the environmental condition on the roof. So to have an idea with kind of filters, then we should have used to filter the potential species which could have been brought on the roof to implement and enrich the biodiversity of the extensive green roof we were investigating. So this is how the procedure looked like. So the 4 ecological filters taken by Landult and the drainage dependent porosity and humus content. Then, of course, we excluded as well other species like the neophyte, for example, which is clear and obvious, and other structural filters like forms, which are not compatible with extensive green roofs. This is a method which is standardized and reproducible. Nevertheless, there is still the importance to refer to experts, because we needed to go through a final expert-led assessment to decide how to handle the species which were ascribed to different classes, or how to handle the orders or alliances, talking about plant sociology, of course, which were represented only by one species, and at the end to obtain a final species list. So at the moment, as it is, it's a semi-expert or semi-automatic assessment that we have done on the study case, of course, but this is of course promising. And we combined it with a very simple microclimatic analysis given here by sun and shaded studies, in order to not only, because we have, of course, went through the plant list or the plant species or the plant assemblages, which we could have sown on the roof, but where to do it? So why considering the roof as it is homogeneous? So we thought to bring a simple shadow analysis into the process in order to sow on the roof, or better to say, to give some direction or suggestions where to sow or plant the species or the target species we wanted to introduce, in order to establish kind of steady communities. And finally, all these ideas of ideas research and applied research I have been presenting in this presentation, this talk, were brought in as a synthesis in the demo project by involving architects, ecologists, so in a very affine way or similar way as the ECOLOPES is doing, in order to consider not only green roofs as part of the biodiversity design, but also the whole environment, the whole envelope, and to consider other species as stakeholders. The project was financed by ZOW, and so the Zurich University of Applied Science, and it was with the aim to support the cooperation between different institutes. So there are the institutes where I work, of natural resources and facility management, which work together with the other two partners from France, Terroico and Chartier-Delix Architects. It is a project which lasted almost 2 years, and kind of synthesized on the webpage. I put two nice QR code for whom is interested to have a look afterwards. So the first and starting point of the project was to make a multidisciplinary state-of-the-art review in order to bring all the partners together. So by writing a paper, to bring all the partners at the same level of knowledge in order to facilitate the cooperation and the development of the framework. Because at the end, the aim of the project is first to develop a new framework to let architects and ecologists working together. So by bringing back conservation biology, architectural design, environmental design disciplines all together. Am I already over time? I'm hearing some.
No, it's all fine. You can just continue.
Okay, sorry, because I have heard some noises. So the topic, the field of investigation of conservation biology, architectural design, environmental design, as I mentioned, within architectural design, of course, smart building assessment should also brought in. And into environmental design, sustainable smart city assessment should be brought in. Nevertheless, by the conservation biology aspect, ICA's targets and SDGs should then support the development of this new holistic design approach, with aim to integrate habitats in the built environment, and namely in the building envelope. So the framework is, of course, ICT enabled. So starting from ecological niche modeling, habitat suitability, geographic information systems, so GIS and geodesign approaches. And from the architectural design perspective, generative and parametric design, building information modeling, so BIM, environment, digital twin, and GeoBIM, which should support the development of the framework. We envisioned already at the beginning of the project the creation of wildlife-friendly buildings, which are in fact connected to gardens. Something I didn't mention already is the importance to build or to implement the green infrastructure, urban green infrastructure. So all the projects we have done are always connected with the surrounding habitats. As I mentioned here, the ecological network is quite is an important aspect to take into consideration, and the demo project aims to implement it. It is, of course, spatial based and enables architects and ecologists to work together in a feedback loop. As I mentioned already, there is a feedback loop between monitoring and ecological landscape design, so should be also within the framework. And there is also practical aspect with this, which is the interoperability issues. Of course, architects, ecologists, engineers use different softwares, different formats. And this was already something we knew at the beginning, and it is something we started to tackle. So the method looks like synthesized in this graphic. We used the campus Gruenthal, which is the campus, one of the campus of our university, Zetave, as a study case. As you see here on the left-hand side, we consider only open data accessible, dealing with species occurrence data, structural habitat data, environmental data, which were used to set species and habitat distribution modeling at a multi-scale level. So from city to building to the landscape. At the same time, we considered as well open data, so the building 3D and also microclimatic simulations in order to enable parametric design to work, in order to develop multiple design solutions. So it is, of course, a method which is based and funded also on ICT development and let's say, yeah, I would say development. So from ArcGIS to Revit to EnviMed to Simoico, which is the software developed by Teroico, which is one of the partners focused on species distribution modeling. And finally, we thought, since we wouldn't have the time to build anything, not even to start monitoring, we thought to implement as well extended reality in the feedback loop as well, as a stage in between. And of course, the results gave us the possibility to test a bit the framework, as we mentioned, to design. We named it Design for Nature. Of course, we didn't invent the term, it is already established. And we wanted to implement in the study case. Some of the results were considering the land use, which is an open data set now at the Swiss level. This was something we needed to face at the beginning as an issue because of proprietary data sets, and fortunately at the beginning of the project after a while, the Swiss Federal Association decided to deliver for free on a lot of spatial-based data sets. One of them is the land use. And according to that and the Simoico software, it was possible to make a first ecological modeling, considering the population viability, for example, and the movability of some target species. Here, just an example, I took the Paragge area as example, but of course there are other bioindicator species which could be used to inform the initial design. And the initial design was inspired by the difficulty of the species growing, living, in the forest to go through the campus. So the idea which was developed by Schwarzenegger architects was to, let's say, go beyond the building, which in fact fragmented the landscape of the campus, which is in fact quite green, but the building itself are not yet greened, if not for just a few small green roofs. So there is in fact a problem or an issue of initial habitat fragmentation. And so the idea which was developed by the architect was to go beyond the existing building with a canopy, which what they called link. So a canopy which is linking habitats fragmented. Here I put a QR code for who would like to know more about the architectural design process behind, would visit the website. And as well I've done for ecological modeling. So if you go on the QR code, you will get more information on it. In this case, would be a WebGIS. So just to let's say resume a bit the procedure, which is converging into the development of a common data environment, which we stated at the end is the fundamental step to start any kind of synergy between different disciplines. And here we made a synthesis as well of the different phases, which were named as strategic planning and project definition, analysis and preliminary design, final design. Of course, we didn't have the realization aspect, and then post-occupancy, which of course we don't have. So at the moment, we finished the project before we started to implement now the architectural design within the ecological modeling. So now we are at the phase of developing this feedback loop, as you see here in this phase. So now we are at this stage. So from small scale ecological modeling back to the parametric design. And so we identify some gaps, of course, that there is a need also to develop ICT softwares and tools which can simulate biotic and abiotic condition. And at the same time, so within the same software, they should be also able to process environmental, so GIS information, 3D buildings, data. So there is always a big issue between 2D and 3D dimension. Also because the design works in 3D and not in 2D. 2D is only a visualization issue. And it should be also a powerful tool or tool powerful enough also to generate geometries and forms, because these methods should be applied at early stages before, of course, going into details. And as well, should be also possible to assess at the early stage as well the impact on the biodiversity targets, which were set at the beginning, so in the strategic planning and project definition phases. Regarding the visualization, we had a nice festival at the end of the project, where I forgot to mention that the project was financed together with other projects, and each project were, let's say, asked to present the results. And since we didn't build anything, so we thought to visualize through extended and mixed reality during this festival, this event, and it was quite successful by playing with the HoloLens, and let also the visitors playing. And before concluding, I think what I've learned, what I would like to resume is to bring the nice example given by Mergi Rudik, who wrote Wild by Design, which is a book who inspired me in the understanding of the landscape as an architect, environmental scientist, and I would say landscape architect after all, is what are we doing here anyway? So when I work, I'll always ask myself, am I designing an integrated multifunctional system? Absolutely, it's imperative. And which services am I providing to nature? As many as the constraint would allow. And these two aspects are fundamental also to design for nature, which means interweaving ecological knowledge and design. With this, I finished my short excursus on the research I've been doing in the last 10 years. And I would be glad to hear your questions and to open the discussion if for you is okay.